Everyone, Professor Jackson here. Today I'm going to go through some basics of what we covered under the November 6th lecture on the nervous system. There's some really important fundamental concepts that you need to understand about the nervous system that are going to affect every different system we talk about in the body in Bio 202. A lot of you were busy studying for the muscle exams during the lecture, and so I wanted to make sure that you don't miss these important details. And those of you that were in class, I want to make sure that a few important points are driven home. So I've decided to record this lecture, and hopefully it'll be helpful. So just like usual, you're welcome to watch the Why This Matters video on your own time. And we'll jump right in with the nervous system. When we think about the nervous system as a whole system, we think about it being the master communication system for the body. We have two primarily communication systems. We have the nervous system, which is very rapid, very fast for quick responses. If you think about it for a second, when you decide to pick up a cup that's sitting on a table, we don't typically notice how long it takes our brain to think about, I'm thirsty, I want to physically move my hand, pick up the cup, and lift it to my mouth, right? It happens instantaneously. So when we talk about the nervous system, we're talking about an extremely rapid system. And we'll talk about the different subtypes of the nervous system, different parts of the nervous system, some of which we consciously control, others happen automatically. So the nervous system is that master controlling communication system for the different tissue types of the body. The second communication system, which you'll start talking about in the beginning of Bio 202, is the endocrine system. And so that's hormones. And it's a much slower acting system than the nervous system. So the nervous system is rapid, specific, and causes an almost immediate response. So the basic functions of the nervous system, there are three different overlapping functions. Okay, and this makes sense. We have a sensory input, so detecting it's hot or it's cold, detecting what something looks like, detecting information about I can feel something touching me, I can feel pain. Those would all be examples of senses, something we can detect, or sensory input, gathering information for the nervous system to make a conscious decision. Okay? Then we have integration, all right? And this is when we talk about homeostasis, the various things that are homeostatic where the brain is controlling the balance, the integration here would be the brain and the nervous system. Okay, so deciding how to interpret whatever we sense. So it's cold, well, then I need to tell my body to pick up the jacket I can see and put on. Okay, or it's cold and I need an automatic response of shivering. Okay, the motor output was how we actually respond. So it's activation of various effector organs. And in the nervous system, our effector organs are going to be primarily muscles and glands. So we're going to spend most of our time really talking about muscles when we talk about the nervous system here in Bio 202. But remember, it also can turn on glands which secrete, for example, sweat or milk, or even endocrine glands, which are told to release specific hormones to affect longer-term communication in the body. So the three overlapping functions: sensory input, integration of the signal, and deciding what to do with it, and then motor output. And we can see those here in this great little example of we see a water glass. So that's sensory input. And then that information is integrated in the brain. The brain decides how to respond, and in this case, it would be telling your arm muscles to lift up a glass. All right. So the functions of the nervous system, we divide the nervous system into several different groups, and you'll notice as we divide it into sort of subsystems, we even have subsystems of the subsystems. Okay, and so you'll see kind of a branching pattern, and I'll show you a nice little graphic in a second that helps you to think about how everything is organized. All right. So we basically have two large parts of the nervous system. We have the central nervous system, and we have the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is essentially the brain and the spinal cord. And if you remember, we've talked about this before, the brain and the spinal cord are basically one continuous organ. Okay? There's not a definite point where we can say the brain starts and the spinal cord starts. So we sort of arbitrarily decide that where this long continuous central nervous system passes through that foramen magnum, through that where the occipital condyles are, and down towards that atlas, the first cervical vertebrae, that is the beginning of the spinal cord. Okay, but it's really more of a gradual transition from brain tissue to more spinal tissue that occurs in that region of the upper neck and the bottom of the head. Okay, so the central nervous system is essentially one continuous big organ, the brain and the spinal cord. And that's really important for integration and control. And that'll be the next chapter that we talk about. We'll talk about what all the brain does and the spine does and how it interprets signals and what it does. Then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything else. So everything, for example, the nerves that run to your fingertips or to your liver or to other body organs and other body parts. So anything that's not the central nervous system, the brain and the spine, would be the peripheral nervous system. And so it consists of primarily spinal nerves and cranial nerves. We divide them into those two groups. Spinal nerves mean that they connect back into the spinal cord. Cranial nerves mean they connect directly into the brain. Okay, and you can see those here. There's the brain and the spinal cord in that sort of peachy color. All right, and that's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything in yellow. And as you can see, some of the cranial nerves here, they control the jaw, the mouth, as well as different things involving the senses and the facial muscles. And then pretty much everything else is going to be a spinal nerve, things that control your arms, things that control your legs. They deal with the various organs in the visceral cavity. All right, so the peripheral nervous system, the part that's outside of the brain and the spine, can be divided further, okay? And we think about its function. Is it going to send signals to the brain to decide how to interpret, or is it going to send signals from the brain to tell the body how to respond? Okay? And so we're going to introduce these two new words that we're going to use in this system as well as other systems later on, and that is afferent and efferent. Okay? So anything that's afferent with an A means it's going towards, going into something. Anything that's efferent is going away from something. Okay, it's exiting. So we can think about A is alphabetically first and E is exit. Okay, so when we talk about the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system or the afferent division, that's going to be important for sensing what's going on in the body. It's going to take impulses from the skin, from the skeletal muscles, from various places in the body and take it to the central nervous system. That's the somatic sensory fibers. And then we have visceral sensory fibers in our body's core that can detect things like there's a pH change, there's a temperature change, there's a blood pressure change. This muscle is more stretched. So the somatic sensory fibers and the visceral sensory fibers together are going to make up this sensory afferent division, sending information to the brain. Okay? We talked about integration a second ago, and then now that's the central nervous system. And then going back down to tell the body how to respond is the motor or efferent division. And so this transmits information from the central nervous system to the muscles and the glands. And we're going to divide that further, this motor or efferent division, into whether it's somatic or autonomic. And the easy way to think about somatic versus autonomic is the word auto. Okay, so just like when we talked about muscles, we talked about smooth muscles and cardiac muscles are involuntary. You don't consciously think about every time you want your esophagus to push food down and say digest, digest, digest. There's a part of your brain that consciously controls that and senses what's going on in your digestive tract and knows that it's time to squeeze those muscles and make them contract so food can go further down into your digestive tract, to your stomach. Okay? Same thing with your heart. You don't want your heart affecting the rhythm of the pacemaker cells. You don't consciously control that typically. So those are automatic, or we would use the word here autonomic. All right. So the autonomic nervous system controls things that you do not consciously control. It's the automatic part of the nervous system. The somatic nervous system, soma means body. The somatic nervous system essentially is the one that you can consciously control. So that's going to be really important for controlling skeletal muscles, thinking, oh, I want a glass of water. So, and you may not think about all the sub-steps. Your brain integrates the signal, but it's going to be deciding, hey, I want to move this arm, all these different arm muscles in a certain way to pick up the glass of water. Okay? So the somatic nervous system, the somatic motor nerves conduct impulses from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. So conscious control in that part of the nervous system is going to affect voluntary skeletal muscles. Okay, so voluntary nervous system is the somatic nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system consists of visceral motor fibers. Okay, it regulates the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and the glands. So telling you it's time to secrete a hormone, it's time to digest something, it's time for your heart to beat faster or slower. Okay, and so that's the involuntary nervous system. And we typically further subdivide the autonomic nervous system into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Okay, and basically these two subparts of the autonomic nervous system work sort of in opposition. Okay, or they work against each other, where one might cause an increase in hormone, the other would cause a decrease in the hormone. One might cause an increase in heart rate, the other one might decrease the heart rate. So basically we divide the autonomic, the automatic involuntary nervous system into two different parts, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we'll touch on that briefly right at the end of the semester. And these are going to be important as we get into the different body systems next semester in Bio 202. So for those of you that are very spatial, here's a nice organization chart you can look at to think about how we divide the nervous system, the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and we can further divide the peripheral nervous system into sensory or motor. So is it afferent going to the central nervous system, or efferent motor coming from the central nervous system to affect a body system? Then we can ask for somatic versus autonomic. Somatic means that we voluntarily control it. So that's going to be affecting skeletal muscles primarily. Autonomic nervous system is going to be affecting things we don't consciously control, that the brain does automatically for you. So those are going to be smooth muscles, glands, and cardiac muscles. And then when we think about the autonomic nervous system, we're going to think about the two subdivisions that kind of work in opposition to each other, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Generally, the sympathetic is going to mobilize body systems when you have some type of activity, where the parasympathetic is more involved with conserving energy and keeping things more at rest. Okay, so that's kind of a generalization, and we'll talk more about that in a few chapters. All right, and when we talk about the brain and we talk about the different nerves in your body, we often think about a nerve cell or a neuron, and we'll get to that in a second. But there's another really important group of cells that are not neurons. So neurons are the cells that can conduct electricity and do the communication itself. Okay, so the communication, we'll talk about in a minute, happens via electricity. But there's also very important support cells that are going to allow the nerve cells to do what they do. Okay, so when we talk about the nervous system and different nervous tissues, we're going to talk about two different types of cells: glial cells, so sometimes we call those neuroglia, and then nerve cells. Nerve cells are excitable cells that actually conduct electricity, that transmit electrical signals from one neuron to the next neuron, or from themselves one neuron to a muscle cell or a gland. Okay? Glial cells are support cells that aid in that function, but they themselves do not conduct electricity at all, so they don't actually do any of the communication. Okay? And there's different types of neuroglia, and they're very similar but slightly different in the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, compared to the peripheral nervous system. So we'll start with the main types in the central nervous system. So in the central nervous system, we have astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes. Okay, so we'll break that down into each cell type and show you some pictures. So astrocytes get their name astro, think astronomy or astrology. Okay, astronomy, the study of the stars. Okay, so here the word cyte means cell, like we've already talked about. So an astrocyte is going to be a star cell. So this is going to be the star-shaped cells that support the nerve cells in the brain and the spine. Okay, they're very abundant. They have that star branch shape, which we'll see in a second, and they cling to the different neurons near their synaptic endings and capillaries. So the synaptic endings would be the ends where they're going to send a signal towards the next cell. All right. So they're really, basically for this class, I want you to understand they're a support cell type. When you hear astrocyte, just think it's a glial cell. It's there to support the neuron. But they have important roles in helping neurons migrate to the right place during development, so you get the right nerve connections. And then early on in early stages of life, it helps nerves make the right connections to the right organs in the right places. It plays a really important role in capillaries, so getting blood back and forth with the neurons. It also can respond to different nerve impulses and different neurotransmitters. The way that the nervous system is going to send signals between different cells, neurotransmitters. So basically, astrocytes are support cells. And here's a picture of an astrocyte. And so in all these pictures, the neuron is just described or displayed as a yellow cell. And then here, in the case, the astrocyte is that kind of brown cell with the purple nucleus in the middle. So it's shaped like a star. Okay, and then here next we have a microglial cell. And microglia are basically literally small glia, so small glial cells. And so microglia are phagocytes. So phagocytosis means cell eating. And so these are going to be cells that are involved with the immune system, as well as in recycling. So microglia are a type of macrophage, which we'll talk about in 202, that are important immune cells that recycle old contents. So if there's an old neuron that's no longer functioning, it could send out signals to microglia to tell it to come gobble up its contents and recycle them so other cells can use them. Or the microglia can sit there and be looking for potential bacteria and some kind of infection that made it into the brain, into the spinal cord, and actually initiate an immune response. Okay, so microglia, their job is essentially recycling cells. And here's a picture of microglia, little glia, they're in red. Then we have ependymal cells, and these kind of have either a kind of a squished squamous shape, if you remember from epithelial tissue, the squamous shape, all the way towards more columnar, where they're more like long columns. But typically they're ciliated, and this is really important because these are the cells that can move around the fluid that exists in the brain and the spine. So we call that cerebrospinal fluid, and that's going to be really important. We'll talk about that some more later, next week even. But the cerebrospinal fluid gets moved around by the cilia on the ependymal cells. So when you see that cell type, think about the cilia moving the fluid along so it doesn't stagnate, so that it keeps flowing. All right, and then the last major cell type we're going to talk about of glia in the central nervous system are called oligodendrocytes. So oligodendrocytes are oligo means many, and so dendro means essentially, we'll talk about what a dendrite is in a few minutes, but essentially it's a projection. It's something that sticks out. So it has many projections. So we say it's a branched cell, and basically what it does is it helps to wrap the central nervous system in insulation. Okay, so if you think about a long cord, like an electrical cord for a second, the nervous system basically works off of electricity, just like many of our appliances and our lamps and things like that do. Okay, just on a much smaller scale. So if I want electricity to flow from an outlet, from a socket in the wall, to a lamp, I usually use a cord. And that cord uses something that can conduct electricity, like copper. Okay? But when you actually plug it into the wall, it's not pure copper that goes from the wall to the lamp. It's wrapped in a piece of rubbery, plasticky material. Okay? And its job is to insulate. Okay? Or it protects the electricity and keeps it going just through the copper wiring from the wall to the lamp, rather than touching the floor and potentially causing electricity to singe the carpet. Okay, so that insulation is very important for keeping the electricity flowing to a specific place that you want it to go. So the oligodendrocytes are a cell type in the central nervous system that are going to basically form the insulation and wrap around the neurons, the nerve cells, to help them have better conduction of electricity. Okay, and that type of insulation in the nervous system is called myelin, or myelin sheaths. Okay, so when we think oligodendrocytes, they're going to have lots of protection, lots of different projections that stick out for protection of the neuron. So you can see the yellow neuron is behind here, or here, or here. 3 different neurons. Here they're labeled as axons, that part of the neuron, or nerve cell. And the oligodendrocytes is all this blue stuff. So you can see this one main central cell, in this case, is wrapping itself around 3 different neurons. 3 different long wires, okay? And so oligodendrocytes provide insulation. All right, in the peripheral nervous system, it's a little simpler. We only talk about 2 cell types that are neuroglia, that are these glial support cells. The first is a satellite cell, and essentially a satellite cell is the astrocyte of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so they're basically there to help with support, different functions of support for the nerve cells. Schwann cells, and you may see them sometimes called neurolimocytes. Excuse me. I'm always going to call them Schwann cells. They're simply named after the person that first identified them and understood what they did. So Schwann cells are essentially those oligodendrocytes. They provide myelin sheaths for insulation around the nerve cell. Okay, so really important, Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes provide that myelin sheath insulation. And that's really actually going to be very, very important, particularly for damaging or regenerating any kind of damage to the peripheral nerve fibers, the peripheral nerve system. All right, so here's a picture of a satellite cell in purple that are actually surrounding a neuron. So here's the nerve cell, the neuron in yellow, and providing support. So you can see they're not called an astrocyte like they were in the central nervous system, simply because they aren't shaped like a star. So they're just called satellite cells. They're there for support. They're around the main neuron cell. And then Schwann cells forming these blue insulation fibers all around the yellow neuron. Okay, next we get into actual neurons, the cells that do stuff for the nervous system, that are the main stars of the nervous system. Okay, so a neuron or a nerve cell are the structural units of the nerve cell. They're highly specialized, and they are basically able to conduct electrical impulses. Okay, and keep in mind, with the exception of primarily the brain and the spinal cord and the central nervous system, the entire peripheral nervous system pretty much consists of nerves that may be wrapped together or close together that project very long distances, and in some cases even are only one cell that project into other different tissue types. Okay, so a lot of times when we talk about different cell types and specific tissues within different body systems, we think about them being a larger group of cells clumped together or organized in sheets or layers. Keep in mind, neurons very often can even be single neurons sticking into another tissue to control their function or to sense what's going on, depending on if they're somatic or they're motor. All right, so are they sending signals to the brain in somatic, or if they're sending signals to the body if they're motor? All right, so a neuron has a very long life. All right, we say they have extremely long longevity. Many of your nerves, or most of your nerves, are going to last your entire lifetime. Many of them do not have the ability to regenerate, so you lose them forever. Not all of them are that way, but many of them are. We say they're generally amitotic, meaning they don't go through the cell cycle in mitosis. They can't make more nerve cells from a stem cell. They're terminally differentiated as a neuron, and they are very have a very high metabolic rate. So they actually require glucose and lots of oxygen to keep them running. They can't use other food sources like fat or protein, which we'll talk about in 202. So all neurons have what we call a cell body or a soma, and they may or may not have multiple processes. So think about when we talk about bones, a process is something that sticks out, all right? So the cell body is going to be the main part that looks kind of like every cell we've talked about so far, that's going to have the nucleus, that's going to have the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria and the different organelles, the Golgi apparatus. All right, that's the cell body. And then the processes are going to be the long extensions that are there simply to conduct electricity. All right? So the neuron cell body, or a soma, is another word for body, is basically the biosynthetic center of the neuron. So because it's going to have the smooth ER, it's where we're going to make membranes. Because it has all the ribosomes, both on the rough ER and in the cytoplasm, that's where we're going to make proteins. Okay? So it's where it makes everything for the entire cell, not just where the cell body is, but also for the projections that conduct electricity. Everything starts in the cell body. It contains the nucleus. Some of them also have different pigments that we can see. And most of the plasma membrane is actually part of a receptive region that receives input from other neurons. All right, so receives electrical input from other neurons. So most neurons in the cell bodies are going to be located in the central nervous system. So the actual main part of the cell is going to be in the spine or in the brain. But there are some exceptions. And anytime we talk about clusters of neurons being together, so groups of those cell bodies being together, we talk about them in the central nervous system as nuclei, or in the peripheral nervous system as ganglia. Okay? So when you hear about a ganglion, that's the singular form of ganglia. A ganglion would be a group of cell bodies, kind of the heart of the cell, the main part of the cell for a neuron, all grouped together somewhere outside of the spine and brain. All right, when we talk about nuclei or one nucleus, that's going to be somewhere like in the spinal cord or in the brain, where you have lots of neuronal cell bodies all clustered together. All right, and when we talk about the processes of the neuron, this is really important. We have arm-like extensions that go out from that main part of the cell body. So in the central nervous system, we can have both neuron cell bodies and their processes. In the peripheral nervous system, we already said most of those cell bodies are actually not in the periphery. They're in the spinal cord, in the central nervous system, and it's only the processes that stick out into the peripheral nervous system. Okay? So in the peripheral nervous system, most of the cell bodies, the main part of the cell, is actually like inside of the spinal cord. And then it's just the processes that stick out into the periphery. And when we talk about bundles of neurons that are all together and sending signals together to certain places, we call those either tracts or nerves. So nerves, which you've probably heard most of your life, nerves are strictly in the peripheral nervous system. So that's nerves going to like your fingertips, or nerves that are going like to your liver, okay, somewhere outside of the central nervous system. When we talk about the equivalent bundle of neuron processes in the brain or in the spinal cord, we call those tracts. Okay, so when you hear the word tract, think it's the same thing as a nerve. It's just about geography. Is it inside of the brain and spinal cord, or is it somewhere outside in the body? Okay, tract, nerve. So there are two types of processes that we're going to talk about. One of them is called dendrites, that's primarily there to receive signal from other neurons, and then axons, which send signal to other neurons, to muscle cells, and to glands. Dendrites, axons. Okay, and I'll go ahead and tell you, we'll say this multiple times, when you think axon, there's always one or less axons, never more than one. So we're only sending signal one place, or have one main way of sending signal to different places, or there's only dendrites. Okay, so here's a general picture of a neuron. You can see this is the cell body here. It's got all the organelles. You can see them kind of highlighted below. There's some mitochondria. There's the endoplasmic reticulum, the nucleus. Okay, that's the cell body. Dendrites are going to be these receptive regions that receive signal from various other neurons. So all these projections over here. And then the big one long connection that's a projection going towards other cells is called the axon. And you can see those myelin sheath and the Schwann cells all along there, headed towards where we have the axon terminal, or the end of the axon. So dendrites, cell body, and then axon. So dendrites are motor neurons. For motor neurons can have as many as hundreds of dendrites that are short, tapering, diffusely branched processes. They contain the same organelles as in the cell body, so some of those bleed over into the dendrites. And they're the receptive, or the input region of the neuron. They tell the cell what electricity is coming in. All right. They convey incoming messages towards the cell body as graded potentials, so a short distance signal. We'll talk about graded versus active potentials in a few minutes. And so in many brain areas, the finer dendrites are highly specialized to collect information from lots of different places. Okay, so here's a picture of a neuronal cell body with lots of dendrites coming off of them. Okay, and then when we talk about the axon, we're talking about the sending signal to somewhere else, to another neuron, to a muscle cell, to a gland. So the axon and its structure, each neuron has one axon that starts at the cone-shaped area. We call that the axon hillock. It looks almost like a hill. So if you can see here, going back a few slides, the axon hillock, where the cell body narrows and goes down towards the axon. Each neuron has one axon that starts at that cone-shaped area, the axon hillock. In some neurons, the axons are very short, or they don't even exist anymore, they're absent. In others, they're almost the entire length of the cell. So some axons can be a meter long. So think about if you have the cell body for some neurons in your central nervous system in your spine, and the axon sends signals all the way down to your fingertips, all the way down to your toes. So they can be very, very long axons, the long part of the cell. So long axons are very often called nerve fibers. So take note, a muscle fiber is the name for the cell, for the muscle cell. Okay. A nerve fiber, however, is only the axon, the part that's sending the signal, not the entire cell. Okay. Muscle fiber is the cell. A nerve fiber is only the axon, the part sending the signal. Okay. Sometimes axons have branches they call axon collaterals that can help send signal to multiple places. And there's lots of branches right at the tip, at the terminus, that can send them to different muscle cells, send the signal to different muscle cells, or send the signal to different gland cells. Okay, but it's one main long trunk, one long tube until you get right at the end where you have the branches. The axon is basically the conducting region of the neuron. It has the insulation around it that we've already talked about, and it generates nerve impulses that and transmits along what we call the axolema. So kind of like we talked about, the sarcolemma is going to be the plasma membrane in muscle cells. The axolema is going to be the plasma membrane or the cell membrane of the axon. Okay. And so we'll talk more about how things work at the end of an axon, at the axon terminus later. But basically, we're going to use neurotransmitters, chemicals, like we talked about in the neuromuscular junction when we talk about skeletal muscles. We'll use neurotransmitters to actually send the electrical impulse in a chemical form from the neuron to the next neuron, or from the neuron to a muscle cell or a gland cell. Okay. So the axon can actually excite or inhibit the neurons at contact. So it can be a positive electrical signal, or essentially an inhibitory electrical signal. And so it carries on many conversations with different neurons at the same time. And axons are going to rely on the cell bodies to make new protein, make new membrane, and basically keep the axon aspect of the cell functioning. Okay. If they're damaged in any way, or they get cut, then an axon quickly decays and can fall apart. So it's a very sensitive cell, part of the cell. So axons can have efficient internal transport mechanisms, and can basically transport things towards the cell body. We call that anterograde. Away from the cell body, we call that anterograde. So from the cell body down the entire axon towards the terminus, or retrograde from the terminus working its way backwards, back up towards the cell body. So retro meaning essentially backwards. And so anterograde will happen for moving organelles like mitochondria, or different cytoskeletal components that help with structure and movement, as well as different membrane components and important enzymes and proteins. would move towards the terminus. In retrograde transport, basically it's going to move things like different organelles that need to be degraded and recycled, or signaling molecules and different viruses and toxins that come in from bacteria. Potentially would work backwards towards the cell body. All right. So there are certain viruses like polio and rabies, HSV, as well as bacterial toxins like tetanus that use the neuron transport pathway of moving things down these long axons to essentially affect the nerve cell and cause damage to the neuron. All right, we already mentioned we have these really important myelin sheaths. So they're composed of myelin, the insulation protein, and it actually is a whitish color. So when we physically see neurons that are white versus gray, we can tell if they're myelinated or not. So a myelinated neuron that has the myelin sheath wrapping around it is white. Those that do not are gray. So when we talk about white and gray matter in the brain in the central nervous system chapter, we're basically talking about, does it have myelin or does it not? Is it insulated or is it not insulated? Okay, so that myelin forms an important insulation to help keep the electrical signal intact and strong. So myelinated fibers are segmented sheaths that surround most long or large diameter axons. Non-myelinated fibers do not contain sheaths, so they typically conduct impulses more slowly. And keep in mind when we say more slowly, we're still on like the millisecond time frame. But myelinated fibers that are insulated are going to work much more quickly than the non-myelinated fibers. So again, we said it's oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system and Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system that wrap around and form these myelin sheaths. I usually say, think about it being like a cinnamon roll. It makes a swirl. We'll see that in a picture in a second. Or the book describes it as like a jelly roll. Okay, so essentially it wraps itself and squeezes itself around multiple times, and so that its plasma membrane with the myelin protein is basically left wrapped all the way around the axon. The plasma membranes have less protein when they get wrapped around the neuron. And so they don't have any channels or carrier proteins to let things in and out of the cell. So they're very poor electrical conductors. That makes them really good electrical insulators to prevent electricity from flowing through. And they also have interlocking proteins that help to bind the adjacent myelin membranes. So it kind of looks like this. You can see the jelly roll or the cinnamon roll. And basically where the nucleus is here, we're going to keep moving in this direction. And as we do, we kind of squeeze the more inner layer very tight, so like we're wrapping around. And as we do that, basically all we're left is these myelin membranes, myelin sheath, that are very poor at conducting electricity, and therefore they're going to insulate the neuron. The yellow part here is the neuron. Okay, so here's actually a picture of that. You can see these myelin sheaths that are all around an axon. So this is the axon. These are some organelles here inside of the neuron, inside of the axon of the neuron. And here's the myelin sheath. And you can see on the outside of the myelin sheath is what's left of the actual what we call the perinuclear collar, or the perinuclear cytoplasm of that Schwann cell that did all the wrapping. All right. So we have spaces along the neuron, along the axon, we call myelin sheath gaps. So this is a place where there's not been a Schwann cell that wrapped all the way around it. There's a little space between the different myelin wrappings. In older texts, you're going to hear these called nodes of Ranvier. We're simply going to call them myelin sheath gaps to keep it easier. But it means the exact same thing. They're basically the spaces that are not myelinated. And so when we talk about the electrical conduction later, we'll talk about it can jump from one myelin sheath gap to the next. In non-myelinated fibers, they're thinner, not wrapped with myelin, so they are surrounded by Schwann cells, but you don't get that coiling. You don't get the cinnamon roll look. So one cell can surround about 15 different fibers in the non-myelinated fibers. So you really don't get true insulation like you do with the myelin. So again, that's that picture. You can see the myelin in blue, and you can see the little myelin sheath gaps right there, the spaces between where the Schwann cells wrapped around. All right. The myelin sheaths in the central nervous system are made by oligodendrocytes, And actually, a single cell can wrap as many as 60 different axons at once. So these support cells, these oligodendrocytes, actually are supporting lots of different axons of different nerve cells, different neurons. So the myelin sheath gaps are still there, but they don't have that perinuclear cytoplasm, that area like the Schwann cell did, that sit outside the wrapping. And the thinnest fibers are actually still going to be unmyelinated, but covered with long extensions of different adjacent neuroglia. All right. And so, like I said, when we get to the brain, we'll talk about white matter versus gray matter. White matter are regions of the brain and spinal cord with dense collections of myelinated fibers. So those are usually fiber tracts, where we have gray matter is mostly neuron cell bodies, and they're primarily non-myelinated. All right. So here's a picture you can see of in the central nervous system. Again, that same picture as before, the oligodendrocytes wrapping themselves around. Okay. And then when we describe the classification of neurons, we define them structurally based on how many projections do they have, or number of processes. Same thing as projections. So are they multipolar? So keep in mind a pole, like a electrical charge. When we talked about poles so far, we've talked about magnets having a north and a south pole. Something that's polar has two opposites typically. So if it's multipolar, it doesn't have two opposites, it has lots of opposites. So multiple projections, multipolar. So these would be cases where we have one axon. Remember, never more than one axon, but one axon and lots of dendrites. So it could be one axon and 2 dendrites. It could be one axon and 300 dendrites. Okay, so that's going to be the most common neuron type in the central nervous system. So it's very important in the peripheral as well, but especially in the central nervous system. We have multipolar. And then in the bipolar system, we have one axon and one dendrite. Okay, they're very rare in the body, but they do exist, like in the retina of the eye and in the olfactory mucosa that's important for smell. So bipolar simply has one input and one output, one dendrite, one axon. And then unipolar almost look like a T process. The cell body kind of sticks up, and it looks kind of like it has 2 axons. Basically, it's one really, really long axon. So sometimes they're called pseudo-unipolar because really it's kind of an axon going in each direction. So it's still technically one axon. We'll see a picture in a second. But we do describe them as having peripheral processes that are associated with sensory receptors or proximal processes which enter into the central nervous system. And so you can see here the pictures, multipolar, lots of dendrites. That's what we've looked at so far. There's the cell body, one long axon that has multiple connections on the axon terminus. In bipolar, you have a dendrite and an axon. Very simple, very straightforward. And then in a unipolar, it almost looks like a T. You can see the cell body sticks up, and you have this one really, really long axon. So sometimes it's called pseudo unipolar because you have on either side there, you have those different connections. And so you can see here some structural variations. Multipolar, this one has lots and lots of dendrites. This looks closer to what we've seen so far. These bipolar can look in different shapes, but still always one axon, one dendrite. And unipolar has that T shape with one axon going all the way across and the cell body sticking out. And so then additionally, we can functionally classify neurons as either sensory, motor, or interneurons. So sensory is going to be important for getting signal to the central nervous system. Okay, they're almost always unipolar, and the cell bodies are going to be located in those ganglia of the peripheral nervous system. The motor are going to take signals from the central nervous system towards those muscles, towards those glands. Okay, so they're multipolar typically, and most cell bodies are going to be located again in the central nervous system with a few exceptions. And then the interneurons are sometimes called association neurons because basically they lie between the motor, the sensory neurons, and help shuttle signals up and down the spinal cord and the brain through the central nervous system. So actually 99% of the body's neurons are interneurons. So they're not actually somatic or sensory or motor. Instead, they're strictly moving signal through the central nervous system. And here's some examples in that chart. All right. So we'll pick up in the next video later talking about membrane potentials in 11.4.